Hi everyone, welcome to today's video where we're going to talk about becoming an expert in the planning process in the UK. So in the UK, the planning permission process is a complete minefield, which is plagued with political and personal influence, which means it's an ever-changing environment for us developers to work within. Now, this does make it difficult for us. However, there are certain key topics that if you understand and you understand well, will make the whole process a hell of a lot easier for you. So first of all, you need to understand the documents and policies which guide decision making. So these are in two main forms. First of all, the National Planning Policy Framework, or the NPPF. This is the government-issued document by which all planning decisions should be made in the UK. So all local plans and local level policies should be adopted in line with policies adopted in the NPPF. So this is the backbone, so to speak, of decision-making in the UK planning system. So as a developer, one of the first things you should be doing is reading and understanding the NPPF so you can understand the overarching policies that make up decision-making. After our national level policies, we have our local level policies. So these are policies are adopted within the council that you're looking to apply to. So everywhere across the UK, we're split up into local planning authorities, and these are the people that you submit the application to. So at this level, we can have local level policies within the local plan or neighbourhood plans. So these policies can differ from those found within the NPPF, and they also give a more localised view of planning policy and planning objectives, importantly around the future and the direction that they want that local authority to go within. So again, it's really important that for whatever authority you're working in, you read their local plan and any relevant supplementary planning documents or neighbourhood plans to understand what their overall arching objectives are within plans over the next 5 to 10 years. So the next key topic is actually understanding your local planning authority. So one thing I always recommend to my students is when you're starting out and when you're getting to grips with planning, don't work with more than 3 local authorities. And the reason is each local authority has a different sentiment and attitude towards development, as well as having different locally adopted plans, as we discussed in the first point. So first of all, of course, we need to be au fait with what their local level plans look like, but then we need to understand how they interpret those policies. So unfortunately, nowhere within any national or local level policy will you find something that says, if a site looks like X, Y, Z, you will be guaranteed planning for 20 houses, for example. So it's always very subjective. There are policies that can be interpreted in different ways depending on who the individual planning officer is, who the planning committee is, or even who you are. You will interpret them different to maybe another developer or a planning consultant. So because of this subjectivity around the policies, you need to understand the decision making in action and the sentiment towards development. So the best way to do this is actually to follow decision making in that authority. So every week there will be a published list of the decisions that have been made at planning. I would go into them and find any relevant ones to the types of sites you're looking to do, so typically residential ones, and look at what got approved, the reasons for the approval, and the level of detail within the application that ultimately got approved. And then also, probably more importantly, looking at the things that got refused, looking at the reasons for refusal to see if there are any trends, to see if certain applications that are maybe a little bit weaker on the documentation side tend to get refused more. So this is maybe a council that needs more hand-holding in the visualization aspect or having the picture painted for them for what this site might look like. It's also important on some of our more subjective policies, for example, limited infilling. So a lot of councils will have an adopted policy around limited infill, either outside of settlement boundaries or within the greenbelt or both. And the issue with limited infilling is it becomes one of the most subjective and difficult to gauge policies to lean on, because there is no measure of what makes a gap a limited infill as opposed to an unlimited infill. So in this situation, it's very important to gauge and understand the local authority's sentiment towards this type of application or other similarly contentious ones, because you'll find one local authority may be quite pro-development as a rule. They may be really aggressive with trying to meet their housing targets, and therefore they're a little bit more relaxed on what classes as being a limited infill, for example. However, the neighbouring council, so literally just across the road, so to speak, could be very adverse to anything outside of a settlement boundary. So that means that although there is an adopted policy around limited infilling, they're more likely to refuse these types of applications because they would argue it's not limited infill. Now, there's no measure to say why one is and one isn't. It's simply sentiment at this point. So that's why understanding and being very familiar with the decision making in your authority can really help or hinder your application and your decision making as to what sites you would and wouldn't bring forward in each local authority. The next key topic that I think you should be really familiar with when trying to become an expert at property development or planning applications in the UK is permitted development rights. So permitted development rights are national level policies that are adopted that allow you as a developer or the homeowner or the landowner to carry out certain works without the requirement for planning. Now, this might sound backwards to say become an expert by looking at something that doesn't require planning, but sometimes the easiest route is the best route forward. So if you can focus on sites that don't require planning or just require a prior notification, then actually you're making your job easier. You're not having to navigate a very difficult and tumultuous environment because you're going for a type of site that doesn't require planning. So being constantly up to date with what are the current permitted development rights, when they do and don't apply, and if there are any changes from that within your local authority, could really help you with picking sites that are more likely to go ahead to get built and get finished and be overall de-risked, because the planning journey in these types of sites is a lot less. The next key topic is pre-application advice or consultations, or a PreApp as most people call them. So our PreApp advice is, as it sounds, pre-application advice. So it's engaging with the council at a very early stage in your planning journey prior to submitting any formal application to essentially get their feedback on what your proposal would be. Now, pre-apps are meant to be quick, 8 to 12 weeks. Sometimes they do take longer. There are some authorities in the UK that actually don't do them, and the cost of them varies from authority to authority. It is not a nationalised costing system. However, the purpose of them is to sit and engage with the council to again understand their sentiment, to understand their desires for your site, what they would and wouldn't allow. And the goal coming out of a pre-app is to feel pretty confident as to the direction you want to take that site. Now, unfortunately, this sometimes means that the pre-app was very negative. So on a site that you thought you were in for a shot with planning, they've completely dismissed the idea. They do not like the concept of development on that site, and therefore you may choose to then walk away from that deal without having spent all the money for a planning application, the drawings and reports that are needed with that, for the risk of getting refused. You can still submit a planning application off the back of negative pre-app advice, but it will then work against you at the planning level. So engaging with local authorities early to really try and get them on board, to make them feel part of the design process and the process of bringing these plans forward, can really help you with obtaining planning further down the line. Another thing about pre-apps is they can highlight where some of the issues might be in an application. So they may be supportive of the concept of the development, but there may be certain issues they want addressing. So for example, they may have issues around the access, or the current use of the site may have some sort of community benefit, so the loss of that could be a negative. So what it can do is it can actually highlight things that you need to address directly and head on in your planning application, because often a refusal won't necessarily come from the fact that the application is just a non-starter. It's because there wasn't enough information for them to come to the decision of an approval. So if you can go into an application knowing exactly what the objections will be, you can really tackle that head on and hopefully come out with an approval on the other end. Now, this kind of links on to our next point, and that is site sustainability and site constraints. So every site will have its own nuances around what makes it good, what makes it bad for planning, what are the pros, what are the cons. No site is ever 100% perfect. Now, when it comes to planning, the key thing is that whenever you do have an issue, be it access issues, infrastructure issues, ecology issues, highways issues, it could be numerous, you simply highlight them as part of your planning application. Because if you are left in a situation with the local authority or any of your statutory consultees whereby they don't have enough information to come to a decision, their default decision would be refusal. So it's very important that you look at your site with a very critical eye and assess where its constraints are. And therefore, with yourself and your team, you come up with a plan to tackle and address head on, and therefore mitigate any of these sites' constraints to make them hopefully acceptable in the eyes of the authority. Some particular contentious constraints for planning can be things like listed buildings, flood zones, and conservation areas. If your site has any of those factors on it, it often doesn't mean that it's a non-starter for planning or that it couldn't be developed. It just really needs to be thoroughly thought through, and any of the issues that arise because it's in a conservation area or because it's in a flood zone are very clearly mitigated and designed out of that scheme so that overall the impact of that site is acceptable. The next key point is community engagement. So whenever a planning application is made, the local authority will write to the neighbours of your application and inform them of what your plans are. Now, it's not uncommon to come up against objections from neighbours. Now, often this isn't necessarily based in actual planning policy. It's simply because they just don't want change, or they don't want a view that they've maybe had for 20 years changing. Now, this is understandable because it's a disruption and people like things the way they are. However, that doesn't mean that it should necessarily get refused for planning, because everybody's house was a field once. So the best way to overcome community objection is actually with community engagement. So my recommendation would be to always run a public consultation event whereby you write to all of the neighbouring landowners within a whatever radius you decide is appropriate to set, depending on where your site is located. You write to them and you inform them that on whatever day at the local parish hall or the local pub, you're going to be holding a public consultation event. And in this event, you will describe to them the proposal for the site, you will share plans, you will share visions, and you can answer any questions or concerns that the local community has. Because often what you find with community objection is you have one or two loud voices who speak on behalf of everyone, and everyone else just kind of goes with them because they speak loudly, they speak passionately, and therefore everyone else thinks they must be right in their opinion. By having a public consultation event, you're able to educate these people around planning policy, what is and isn't acceptable at planning, why you're planning compliant with the application you're making, why this could be a benefit to the local community. Often you would want to talk about things like the housing crisis. A lot of people that object are also parents whose kids can't afford to get on the housing ladder. So it's very important to sort of play on any of these issues, and overall you want to come out of that public consultation event with support from the local community, or at least less objections. And off the back of that, you'd want to do surveys. Often we print out little pamphlets when we do a public consultation event with questions that we want people to answer. From that, we can produce a report which says these were the findings, that 74% of people in the local authority were supportive of our application. You will still have objections lodged against your application as and when it gets submitted. But if you can show you've gone through this process of, first of all, engaging with the community and therefore hopefully putting forward results that go in your favour, the local authority really appreciate this because they see that you've tried to engage with the community, you've tried to educate them. So often a lot of the objections that are left are NIMBYism, for lack of a better term. The next key point is design and sustainability. So the design of the site, as in what does that site look like, is really important because a lot of authorities do try to preserve certain characteristics within their community. So if you've got an area which has a very strong architectural design locally, you want to show something which mirrors that or is complementary to that. If you have an area which has a lot of very uniquely built properties, again, you would want to show something that has unique characteristics because that would be in keeping with the local character. Anything that is in keeping often has more chance of getting an approval. Unfortunately, this often does mean that we have a lot of houses that look the same, which is a objection that a lot of people put forward. However, that is a policy of local authorities, which somewhat strong arms developers into building much of the same. Sustainability measures are becoming more and more prominent and a more and more important point in our planning applications. So how sustainable is this site from an environmental, a transport, and an overall community welfare perspective? So again, this is a matter that you want to tackle head on in your application. So you want to show positive ecological benefits. You want to put forward transport assessments which show the migration of traffic. If we are in a more rural location, you want to argue why perhaps the use of cars is going to be acceptable. It may be that you have a higher end product and therefore the argument is the owners of these houses probably wouldn't be getting the bus even if the house was in the city centre. So again, just addressing the fact head on. And then to sort of combine these factors, sustainability and design, I always like to put a lot of visual aids forward. So in the past, things like sketch drawings were fine. Nowadays, we're seeing things like CGIs and virtual reality being used a lot more in planning applications to really paint a picture for those councillors as to what this site will look and feel like. We're going to have street scenes, we're going to have individual unit CGIs, bird's eye view CGIs of the entire site, so you can really try and paint a picture in their mind of how beautiful your site's going to be. A lot of applications that I see refused are refused simply because they don't have enough supporting evidence. And one key one that I think really can make a difference is the visualization aspect. So images, really paint that picture, because in the absence of a clear image or clear information, the council will refuse an application. Another key thing is just understanding the planning process, the planning forms, the documentations that are going to be needed so that you're comfortable with what that process looks like so you can do it more efficiently. Understand the documents that are going to be needed at the submission stage, understand as and when the consultee process will be finished, know who your point of contact is with the council, know when your key dates are, so you can really stay on top of the application and make sure it's moving forward as swiftly as possible. Another key point is understanding any potential objections and your statutory consultees. So every application will go through a consultee process whereby certain people will be consulted for their opinion on that application. Now, depending on the site will depend on who your statutory consultees are. You can look online to find out who this would be for any given application, depending on what it's near, what's on the site, what the proposal is. Now, one really good exercise I think to do is to sit and look at your application and try and put yourself in the mind of, let's say, the historic England, so listed building. If we were looking at this listed building and the impact on this listed asset, what does this site look like? And really try and think of it from their perspective, and therefore try and think of any objections they might come up with. And again, try and handle these from the outset of the application. So rather than waiting for the consultee to go to them, come back with objections and then trying to change plans, try and preempt them as much as possible. So really think from the mindset of the consultees, know who your consultees are, know where the objections are coming from, and tackle them head on from the early stages of your application. But ultimately, you just have to be prepared. There will be some objections to every application, be it from the neighbours or maybe one of the consultees. This doesn't necessarily mean you'll get refused, providing elsewhere you have enough support, enough evidence, and enough data to show why you should be approved in this situation. You want to be very familiar with the permission conditions. So often when we do have an approval, we will have something called a Section 106 agreement. So this is a legal agreement between the developer and the local authority, which controls the way that site is ran. So there can be conditions around working hours, around when you can start on site, and works that have to be carried out, or information that has to be submitted to the council prior to work starting on site, as well as any contributions financially or for affordable housing are gained via the Section 106 agreement. So it's very important that you're familiar with what these conditions mean, that you have a legal representative look over this legal agreement for you rather than just signing it, to make sure you're not signing anything that would shoot you in the foot later on. It's important to understand what conditions they're asking for and what extra work this might entail, and therefore what extra cost. So for example, in some areas you may get something like an archaeological condition. This means that prior to starting on site, you have got to have done at least one investigation dig to see whether or not there could be any archaeological artifacts in the ground. If they are found, you would then have to do an excavation off the back of it. This can cost tens of thousands of pounds, all from one planning condition. So it's very important that any conditions you do get, you're very comfortable with and you understand what they mean and the impacts of them, and you don't sign a 106 agreement until you're happy with all of the conditions. It's important that you get legal advice on the 106 agreement, because if a 106 agreement isn't legally binding, you can in fact be refused permission for it. Once you've got this agreed and it's all signed, it's very important then that you follow through with complying with the 106 agreement, otherwise you can get planning enforcement notices. Another key thing is working with the relevant development professionals, you cannot do this on your own, and you shouldn't as a developer. It's important to have a very strong team around you of people who understand the planning system, ideally maybe have some local contacts or local knowledge, and are really comfortable and familiar with the overall sentiment of that authority. So your professional team at planning is typically going to be your architect and planning consultant. You may have additional consultants like transport, ecological consultants, heritage asset consultants. Depending on the site and depending on its nuances, you may bring in a wider team around you. It's very important that everyone is aligned on the same goals and objectives with your planning journey to make sure that we put forward the best application possible. And overall, just keep up to date with changes. The planning system is constantly changing. There's constantly new policies being added and removed. There are constantly policies that are being overturned because they've not been followed. And it's very important you stay up to date with this to make sure you've always got a competitive edge when it comes to submitting planning applications. So hopefully that video was useful and insightful as to how to become an expert in the UK planning permission system, and you feel a little bit more confident, hopefully taking on some of your own sites. If you want to learn more about our Development Mastermind program, click the link in the description where you can book a call with my team. Don't forget to comment below any videos you want to see from me in the future, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.